Sardinians have a freakishly long lifespan. No matter where you stand on the blue zone debate and discussion, you cannot deny the fact that the Sardinians, they are a blue zone, have a very, very, very good lifestyle. It seems to work really well for them. They have one of the highest concentrations of centenarians of any region in the world. As a matter of fact, they were the literal first declared blue zone when Dan Buettner went out and kind of set the whole thing in motion. But what's interesting is if you look at the World Data Atlas, it's really interesting because their average life expectancy is 82.6 years old from birth. That is a huge life expectancy. And what's extra interesting about Sardinia is it's still growing year over year. The life expectancy is increasing, which in a world where things are just largely unhealthy, that is very interesting. So what is different about their diet? And what can we take away from things that they do or things that they eat or their lifestyle in general that we can add into our life to maybe get a little more out of it? Okay, the first thing that is the most interesting, believe it or not, about Sardinia is that the men live really long. They live equally as long and in equal numbers as the women. Now, why is this unusual? Well, normally when you look around, there's about 5 women for every 1 male centenarian. So what that means is that there are 5 more women living over 100 years old. In Sardinia, it's a 1-to-1. The men and women both live over 100 quite often. Now, we're going to investigate this a little bit more, because what is it specifically that makes it so that the men live longer here? Well, we have to unpack quite a bit, but let's look at what their diet looks like. How is the Sardinian diet different from other blue zones and different from the rest of the Mediterranean? Before we get into the actual numbers and what you can do differently, I put a link down below for 25% off Seed Daily Synbiotic. They've been a sponsor on this channel for a long time. If you're changing your diet in any way, like you're trying to add new foods in, you're trying to make a change, I would go on record and say one of the biggest levers that you can pull is altering your microbiome by eating more fiber, by adding in a good probiotic, by adding in fermented foods. It is a huge lever that you can pull that you can feel very, very quickly. So I usually recommend people start with that and start with adding in more protein as well. So check out that link down below, and a big thank you to Seed for the continued support on this channel, and your support helps this channel as well. So link down below. Sardinians' diet is different on the surface compared to the other Mediterranean countries because Sardinia consumes about 40% carbs, where the rest of the Mediterranean is on average about 60% carbs. And a lot of the blue zones are in that same 60% region too. So Sardinia sits on a very low carb spectrum compared to the other long living countries. Now clearly the other countries and the other regions that are living long are doing something right, even when they have 60% carbohydrates. So we don't want to sit here and say that the carbohydrates are the reason. But what's quite interesting is that if the carbohydrate content is lower, then that probably means the protein intake is higher and the healthy fat intake is higher. So is it the absence of carbohydrates, or is it the addition of more protein or the addition of more essential fatty acids? The bottom line is that there's something there, so we need to unpack it a little bit more. Now, interestingly enough, their diet is just pretty simple Mediterranean. They eat a lot of lean meats, they eat the occasional beef, they eat quite a bit of cheese, quite a bit of nuts, quite a bit of veggies, quite a bit of fruits. It's very, very Mediterranean, just slightly lower carb. But there's specific foods that they eat that we have to highlight because they're very unique to Sardinia, and it would be, I don't know, kind of unprofessional to not disclose them when other regions don't consume a lot of them. The first one is a unique oil called mastic oil. Now, mastic oil comes from the mastic tree. Now, this particular oil, there's a lot of literature out there on it, but we're starting to see the best literature just suggests that it's heavily anti-inflammatory. And inflammation, especially when it comes down to aging, is very important for proper DNA repair, for proper function, for proper rebuilding. And if you're highly inflamed from a bad diet, this doesn't happen as well. You have shorter telomeres, potentially less, more DNA damage, a series of other issues that could come to play. There was a study that was published in Immuno, and it looked at in vitro, which is like petri dish stuff, and in vivo. So in this case, it was rodent models. They found that in vitro with mastic oil, that there were reductions in what are called phosphoproteins that were precursors to inflammation. So essentially, it was reducing the building blocks of inflammation. And then when you look at the more living organism research, when you look at rodents, it gets more interesting. With the rodents, they found that it blocked inflammation from getting into the tissues altogether. So when I think about this, I'm thinking, like maybe this is inflammatory. Maybe this is inflammation related. Now let's move into the next one that's a little bit more fun, because you're not gonna go buy gallons of mastic oil and drink it for its health benefit, but you might eat more of this cheese. So the cheese that the Sardinians eat a ridiculous amount of, by contrast to other ones, is Pecorino Romano. This is sheep cheese. Now, Mediterranean countries in general eat pecorino, okay, but Sardinia eats the lion's share of their cheese in this form. They eat a lot of sheep cheese, a lot of goat cheese, a lot of those forms. And when you look at how it functions in the body, it kind of makes sense that it's this good for you. So it's 3 to 5 times higher in CLA, conjugated linoleic acid, than any cow cheese. And I'm not saying cow cheese is bad, but the high amounts of CLA is a unique naturally occurring trans fat that has a myriad of different health effects. So we've seen it reducing inflammation. We've seen it tremendously good for fatty acid oxidation. So helping actually burn more fat in less of the body composition settings and more of just like the metabolic utilizing fats as a fuel source sort of settings. So very, very interesting there. It's also antimicrobial, antibacterial. It's very low lactose. Because it's aged, it's easier to digest, so it's less strain on the system. But there is some interesting research that really found interesting things about Pecorino Romano. Now, this study was published in the journal Foods, and full disclaimer, it was done in rodents, but it gives us a lot more literature to really look at. Specifically in the liver, Pecorino downregulated SREB1, I'll explain what that is in a second, and also downregulated ACACA. These are genes that are associated with what is called de novo lipogenesis, that is taking carbohydrates and turning them into fat. So when we turn those genes down, we potentially reduce the risk of storing carbs as fat, in this particular case, in the liver. So less liver fat. We do know that liver fat and visceral fat are two very not good things heavily associated with metabolic dysfunction. So if we can turn down the genes a little bit that are associated with turning carbohydrates into fat, then specifically in the liver, then we have a very good thing. That does not mean that you can just go wolf down a bunch of Pecorino Romano along with a Jack in the Box taco and you're gonna be fine. It just means as a lifestyle cheese, it's kind of a good thing. And then there's also benefits as far as like PLIN2 and other genes associated with brain health. Less lipid accumulation, less inflammation in the brain, less instance of neurodegenerative disease. So again, we just have to look at the outliers here because these specific things are so different when the rest of the diet is very similar to other blue zones or very similar to the rest of the Mediterranean region. But then we have the one crazy one that has some nuance to it. This is called Cannanou wine. There was a study in food chemistry found that Cannanou wine had some of the highest, if not the highest, concentrations of gallic acid, as well as just antioxidants in general. And this Cannanou wine, by the way, is a very specific wine to Sardinia. It's a specific Sardinian grape. It's kind of wild because I did a video a little while ago that was talking about the newer literature suggesting that like any amount of alcohol is bad. It is going to ultimately decrease all-cause mortality or increase all-cause mortality and decrease lifespan. So it's kind of interesting when you see like, okay, the Sardinians consume this Cannanou wine. Perhaps we need to look a little further. Okay, their lifestyle is very different. Okay, it's a lot lower stress. They're laughing a lot. They're having fun. They're joking. Lower stress along with a small amount of this wine. Some people probably drink a lot of it. But the antioxidant profile is part of like a regularly like scheduled part of their diet. That does have some benefits. Some of the enterocyte studies with Cannanou wine show that it can completely block inflammation. So it could be one of the most powerful inflammatory blocking like beverages that's out there. But if you were to just consume this while living sort of a standard American lifestyle, diet, and barely moving, it would be just as bad as drinking other alcohol. Like you're not gonna outdo the negative parts of your life by adding antioxidants from wine. Right? It's like in their particular case, their lifestyle is crafted so well that the wine is actually helping them. But in most people's cases, the wine is going to be detrimental. Now, that brings us into sort of the next piece. Why do the men live so long? Well, it's interesting because in Sardinian culture, The men carve out time almost every day to be with their friends, crack jokes, and kind of live that life, right? The Sardinians, if you look through the history books, like they're notorious for being like kind of a hilarious culture. They laugh a lot and men like to joke. Like it's kind of like a big thing in history. And there's set aside time that men actually take for themselves socially to laugh and enjoy life. And it's kind of interesting when you look at Sardinia and you say, oh, wait a minute, like the men are living in equal amounts as long as the women. You look at other regions and the men work, and they probably sacrifice not necessarily the social life, but they sacrifice the true meaningful relationships. Not to say that women don't sacrifice those too, because I'm sure they do. But in a lot of cultures, it's like drilled into men's heads that like you work, you provide, you go home, take care of your family, and like it's just become like norm, right? So in a culture where like the men actually take the time to say, hey, I'm gonna like take care of my life. Sometimes that's the best thing you can do as a provider, is actually take care of yourself and laugh so that you can be around for a long time. There was a study published in Epidemiology that took a look at 17,000 people and they looked at laugh frequency. They found the more that people laughed, the lower their risk of dying. Plain and simple. Now, you gotta love epidemiological stuff because it leaves a lot of context out. Okay, but there was also a study published in Diabetes Care. So the study had people consume like a regular meal, and then after the meal, they would either listen to a boring lecture or watch a comedy. They did this for a couple of days. And what was very interesting is that even people that were type 2 diabetic and could not process glucose well, if they watched the comedy, their glucose levels went down. If they watched the lecture, they would respond how it was expected to respond. The comedy actually allowed their glucose response to be not a little bit better, a lot better. Something to do with the vasodilation, probably the neurotransmitters, probably just the hormones and the catecholamines that say, hey, I feel good. So the social aspect, the laughing, this isn't just like woo-woo-y stuff where, hey, it's good for your body to laugh. There's actually some interesting literature and stuff that happens physiologically. So Sardinians, they eat cheese that's really good, they eat mastic oil, they eat a few less carbohydrates than other regions, they drink a little bit of wine on occasion, and they carve out time for themselves. I suggest you do that. I'll see you tomorrow.